All right, welcome back. We are doing chapter 9 on race and ethnicity and discrimination and racism and historical perspective. And this is episode 2. Okay, so what I was talking about last time, we kind of left off here. It's really about what characteristics, because we know that race is socially defined much more than biologically, what characteristics we choose to pay attention to and how we classify people based on those characteristics. I mean, when I see this thing, oftentimes, and I know it's important so that we can get an idea of this, but in the past, it's been used in a way to put people in a box. But what box do we put ourselves into? And in what ways do we sort of enable the old school notions of race, or do we take responsibility and start to build new ideas of what that means? Now, I have already talked about race science and scientific racism a tiny bit. I think some of seeing these important pictures that people were drawing early on and kind of the extent that they would go to make people less than human so that they could oppress them. It's important for us to know this. I kind of said before, we got to pay attention to our historical timeline. There's the past, here's nowish, and then there's the future. And we really do need to know what's happening now. We really do need to know what happened in the past, because we're obviously going to be dealing with this, and we don't want to be dealing with it in the same way over and over and over, right? We need to learn as human beings. That's our hope. So in the 18th century, physical attributes became part of the definition of race. Folks from Europe deciding what's important, what looks right, what doesn't, and then who's more human and who's not. And then, of course, labeling it as race science or scientific racism. I mean, you put the lab coat on or you put the word scientific in front of it, even if it's not using science to come to these conclusions, you're still going to be able to have some really real impacts. And of course it did. Developing race science in the 19th century tried to rank races according to their stages of evolution. Read this on your own, but it's really bizarre and just kind of a racist explanation of where people came from and how breeding of monkeys happened across from Africa, and just the types of really long-winded articles and unfounded science, right, that was done, pseudoscience, a long time ago to get us where we're at now. Looking at the Negroid sane criminals, Negroid civil insane, what that looks like, phrenology, skull type, making up things that were supposed to be missing links. There's, again, somebody measuring the head of somebody to try and get the idea of who's more human, who's less human, who's more likely to be a criminal. I mean, you're really determining, without science at all, just how you're lining up your society. You're really determining some incredibly awful things for the future of folks, and particularly people of color, folks from Africa and other places besides people of European descent. So Human Genome Project, genetically, and this is important to know, there's there's those folks with their tiki torches and some more members of the KKK indoctrinating folks from a really young age. If we look at it, though, genetically, all human beings, nearly identical. Science, right? Less than 0.01% of the total gene pool contributes to racial differences. Now, we're not going to convince these folks, likely, and without a great deal of effort. Deprogramming racism is a really, really intense piece. You may have heard of Jane Elliott. You're going to have to see that film, and we're going to talk about Eye of the Storm, the blue-eyed, brown-eyed study. Jane Elliott has been doing incredible work for decades and decades and decades, and now people are calling upon her and other folks to really get involved, and they're searching for this information because of the current BLM movement and what's going on with race in the society in this country, looking for leadership and looking for people who can really explain it. Dr. Cornel West and so many others, and we're going to look at that throughout the course of the semester, and you're going to get to watch that. Race science, not correct at all. People are more physiologically similar than different, with race traits or physical traits varying more within each racial group even than between them. But we can't link any gene or genes to race, and we know that it's been used to support and lead to discrimination, right? Almost exclusively throughout history. We define and redefine by race because of political, religious, social interests. And again, we know, as we've been looking at society and culture and what that looks like for human beings, that is always, always, always changing. So Race is always being defined and redefined, and people and groups of people being defined and redefined. And we see that happening all the time, and that's why history is so important, because we would see, going back time and time again, when our economy goes down or takes a downturn, dominant culture looks at people of color and says, certainly you must be stealing our jobs. But if we back it up again, we know that that happens in those economic downturns, and that's when we turn to racism, and those jobs are not the jobs that people in dominant culture with a great deal of privilege are oftentimes even willing to work. So yeah, it takes a lot of looking at history through a sociological lens and through many of our different paradigms, so that we're looking at it and not just trying to seek out injustice strictly, but how is it functioning, how have things changed and been positive, and then what do we need to do, right? All right, so what does your ethnicity mean to you? Moving away from race, right? Let's get to the ethnicity piece. A lot of times when I ask this in a live classroom and I go around and I ask everybody, just all sorts of people, and it's right off the top of your head. And when I ask dominant culture folks, it's almost 2/3 of the time where folks say nothing. I don't know. I haven't thought about it. And that is an instrument or a result of privilege. And in all actuality, if you haven't had to think about what your ethnicity or your race means to you, it's because, largely because you're in dominant culture, and you haven't had to. You haven't maybe been in a situation where you've been the minority or consistently enough to have to sort of alter your behavior to the dominant culture's belief set and cultural practices and all that. So maybe it means a great deal to you, and in often cases, it doesn't. Ethnic groups, so people who are generally recognized by themselves or others as a distinct group, based entirely on social or cultural characteristics. We're moving away from biological traits with race and looking at social characteristics. So a social characteristic that passes from generation to generation. We receive ethnicity more positively because we understand now that it encompasses a much greater spectrum of who people really are, right? So a shared cultural heritage. People that find themselves as members of an ethnic category have a distinctive identity. They have common ancestors, language, religion, and like race in ways, ethnicity is also socially constructed. Good reminders here, right? Just to sort of solidify this when you go back to study and practice for the exam, and just so that you have these. Now, I want to get us into a habit of practicing the right things multiple times. And then by the time you go to be tested about it, instead of that information right when you're done being like, just like, see you later, gone forever. I want my students to retain this because I think sociology and what we're learning is really, really important and super important concept. So ethnicity, shared culture, heritage, socially constructed. Ethnicity is more complex than race for most folks. And the United States is a multi-ethnic society. And yet, of course, we know we're multicultural, multi-ethnic. We also struggle quite a bit with it, really in ways, in large part, because we have not addressed the institutionalized racism and discrimination, which prevent us from enjoying and or understanding that equality is that important component. You just can't be a multi-ethnic or racial society with massive amounts of inequality and expect things to really work in a functional way. So race constructed from biological traits, but we know, like, if there's an element of that, it's race. We know that race is socially constructed, right? Ethnicity, however, is constructed from cultural traits. So from a biological point of view, knowing a person's racial category, again, can't predict anything about it. So in a way, race means nothing, right? And a whole lot at the same time. Bizarre. Nothing in biological ways, physiological ways, so much, very, very, very little, and just everything socially, right? So many things socially. So because of the tremendous levels of inequality in our society, based on race or ethnicity, we have to ask ourselves some really important questions, you know? Why do we place such an important emphasis on race? I mean, that's our choice. This is the institution's choice. Why does it matter so much? Why does race matter so much? It does, okay? Whose interests are served because of this emphasis? How does society benefit or harmed by this framework of race? Because we have to understand that having massive inequalities that we know about It's not. It's helping a very small percentage of people. For the most part, it is hurting this country and our ability to really fulfill the reality that we want to strive, or that we do strive so hard for, right? Equality. So then the question is, sociologists, how can we create a more just or a more equal society? First and foremost, how can we change our views of race or ethnicity to reflect a more accepting paradigm? And I guess then WWYA, not WWJDD, which is what would Jason Downing do? What would you ask as a sociologist to understand the past, the present, and the future of race relations? Because that's important to know, right? Again, that timeline piece. Here's where minority and majority groups already exist. Okay, we have a good idea of this in your head already, but this is what we're really looking at. I went to school in Iowa. My partner, she's from Minnesota. Not a lot of ethnic diversity there. Some. Colorado, more so. I'm originally from Chicago, which is a lot more, it would seem, than living in Colorado. Anyway, this is how it's broken up here. So let's look at one of the paradigms, symbolic interactionism. Minority groups share certain traits, okay? The membership is involuntary. It's not about numbers, but control of resources when we're talking about minority groups. They have been denied privileges of mobility, privileges of opportunity, privileges to be able to accumulate wealth, treated as members of a group regardless of individual merits. So when we look at symbolic interactions, we then start to look at this idea of stigma, right? An attribute that is discrediting to an individual or group because it overshadows other attributes and merits of the individual or the group may possess. Maybe somebody says gender, and here's a gender stigma. And now we have a dominant and preferred gender and one that is not, or many that are not, right? Mixed contacts, interactions between those who are stigmatized and members of the dominant non-stigmatized group. Mixed contact is an important concept for deprogramming of racism and discrimination. Intergroup contact. If people aren't interacting amongst different ethnicities, or if we're looking at our construction of race, different races, then those opportunities to learn, which is where the deprogramming of racism really happens, those learning opportunities, they just don't exist in ways that are able to benefit people as much. So majority and minority groups, let's define those. Any category of people distinguished by physical or cultural differences that a society sets apart and subordinates, okay? So based on race, based on ethnicity, or differing levels of ability. And again, we come back to these important characteristics, and that's a distinct identity, or like a visibility, you see that, and an experience, subordination, or disadvantage when we're talking about minority groups. Now, we'll talk about majority in a minute, but you share an identity and you experience that subordination in a society. Maybe that's access to jobs, access to housing, access to education, access to healthcare, on down the line. So minority group, any group that is assigned an inferior status in a society. A group that has less than its proportionate share of wealth, power, and social status. Again, I'm not thinking that everybody's going to be equal all the time. I don't know that that's attainable. But we certainly don't need something that's so unequal you can't even see my hand off camera. Woo, waving it around, right? So oftentimes a minority group member or minority group members are discriminated against by those in the majority. And we've set up justification for how and why they should be discriminated against. So if a society functions on that and believes that and continues to function that way, then it's not only there, but it's justified and built into the very institutions. We understand that. So question, the media most often portrays minority group members as, and I guess I'll wait like Kermit. Hi-ho, this is, no, sorry. The media most often portrays minority group members as, and now let's look at majority groups. Majority group, any group that is dominant in society. And we'll talk about that because numerical measurements are not necessarily just what we're looking at here as sociologists. Any group that enjoys more than its proportionate share of wealth, power, or social status, and quite a bit more is what we're talking about. Usually a majority group is in a position to dominate or exercise power over other groups, and then therefore does. Stanley Milgram test, the Jane Elliott blue-eyed, brown-eyed study. When that opportunity exists, oftentimes people take hold of it. And then we are somewhat unconscious to our privilege, But we also know when we think it's slipping away. People in dominant groups or majority groups don't want to lose that unearned privilege. Minority majority groups oftentimes determined by race or ethnicity can be determined by sex, physical disability or ability, love, relationship orientation. And bringing that down here to the numerical piece, women make up over 50% of the population. They're a majority, but are the minority in so many other important cultural, statistically measurable ways that they are considered a minority or subordinate member when we're talking about sociological terms. So a group's role and status then, according to that, right, not its numbers, make it a minority or a majority group. Role and status, share of power, share of access, share of education, share of health. We can look at it across the board. So majority dominant, minority subordinate. Do you consider yourself a minority or majority member of this society? All right. Let's get a little bit into prejudice and stereotyping. We understand these concepts. Here's a little bit more about them. Prejudice, rigid and unfair generalization about an entire category of people, right? And stereotypes, an exaggerated description applied to every person in some category. I mean, you know, you could say I'm prejudiced against old people driving, because I just think every single one of them is horrible. I would have a prejudice. Stereotype, white men can't jump, right? You know, kind of thing. But exaggerated, applied to everybody, right? Those people aren't as smart. They don't learn as well. Those people are just emotional, right? So prejudices and stereotypes, again, very real in their impact on people's lives. Racism, we know about racism as well, a belief that one racial category is innately superior or inferior to another. We have actual white supremacists in this administration, Stephen Miller, working in the White House and in this administration. You would think, I would think that I wouldn't have to deal with this. We wouldn't, that our grandparents did. But again, we are still dealing with it here. And that's not a political piece. That's identifying racism at the highest levels of our culture and then saying to ourselves, how does that reflect our values or not? How do people resist and or rebel against that idea or accept it? Stuff that we've been talking about all semester long. Widespread throughout our history where ideas about racial inferiority were supported and supported the ideas of slavery and still do. Decrease in overt racism in the United States, but still a serious social problem. And that's previous to about 12 years ago, right? We have seen in the last decade an uptick in all sorts of hate crimes and all sorts of overt racism, institutionalized racism. And now we find ourselves engaged in a struggle, an important struggle to level the playing field and really truly address particularly institutionalized racism, particularly within our criminal justice system and how people treat African-American folks and people who are brown, people who are minorities in this country. So discrimination, institutional prejudice and discrimination and bias built into the operation of society's institutions. We know exists. We created it. It's created to serve some people and disadvantage others. And of course, one of the reasons I've done so much race relations work is because it's hard for me to wrap my head around how that would truly advantage somebody or advantage a society. Ultimately, even though we feel it does, and it does in the moment, it's a huge disadvantage to the people who are using that privilege. It never turns out in a positive way over time. Giving up that privilege and taking responsibility, a core piece of that for sure. Trayvon Martin, George Zimmerman, George Floyd, the names are too numerous to mention. That's how we know that institutional discrimination and prejudice, that very thing that's built into our, the very bias that's built into the workings of our institutions, is something that we need to address and do something about. And not just talk about it, obviously. Unequal treatment of individuals on the basis of their membership or group, discrimination. It can be targeted and intentional or unintentional. It denies equal opportunities and blocks access to valued resources. And this is a study pre-2010, still continues to be a problem. People or applicants with Black or minority sounding names, twice as likely not to get called back for a job. We've got to wrap our heads around finding ways to have the least bias in finding work and employment that we can. We haven't done so in effective ways or as effective as we could. Individual discrimination, overt and intentional, unequal treatment, often based on prejudicial beliefs. certainly denying an application, like I said, based on race, but that can be housing, and that can be healthcare, and that can be your very life in many instances. Now, controversial or not, but toppling a lot of statues, and a lot of the statues that are being toppled are statues that are being toppled of traitors to the United States, during the Civil War and post-Civil War. And it wasn't really right afterwards when those monuments were erected, most of them erected in the last 40, 50, 60 years, and protected, right? So institutionalized discrimination, more detailed, enshrined in law, public policy, and common practice, right? It's embedded in routine operation of our major social institutions. It's present in businesses, schools, hospitals, governments, you name it. And it's initially institutionalized in the Constitution, redlining, subprime lending, that's ownership and wealth of homes and where people can live. The war on drugs is entirely based in institutionalized discrimination. And certainly there's a powerful influence on the wealth gap between whites and blacks, or more importantly, people in dominant culture and those in minority culture, as we look at our history. Prejudice and discrimination begin as ethnocentric attitudes, right? Our group is better than theirs. We do things the right way, in-group, out-group, stuff we've already talked about. Groups can be placed into a situation where they're socially disadvantaged and labeled. Then a group situation is explained as a result of innate inferiority rather than looking at the social structures that built that. And then here we go. The cycle repeats itself. And it's really, really important to understand that you can't just talk about it. These people's movements happen because of a dire need to change systemic racism and discrimination that isn't just whether people lead a good life or have a lot of life opportunities and chances, as we've talked about, but whether they live at all or whether their children live at all. There's White Men Can't Jump, or at least a little clip off of that. Prejudice and stereotyping. Prejudice, a belief about an individual or group that is not subject to change on the basis of evidence. So people just carry that prejudice with them. You can show them things to the contrary, and they still won't believe it, right? So negative stereotypes of African Americans developed after Europeans discovered the economic value of exploiting their labor and natural resources. And even positive stereotypes are still racist, right? And we have to understand that, again, the Civil War wasn't about states' rights. It was about slavery. It was about exploiting and finding an economic value to human beings and exploiting that labor, exploiting those natural resources, and the unwillingness to stop relying on that as your main sort of economic driver. All right, heavy stuff, but responsibility, not guilt. I love you. All of my students continue to be good people and do good things, and we'll get around to episode 3 in a bit. All right, cha-cha-cha. Take care, everybody. Peace.